In 1968, Father Demetrius Constantelis published his first edition of Byzantine Philanthropy and Social Welfare. In this work, he explained how the Christian church in the Greek-speaking provinces of the Roman Empire came to use the noun philanthropia, which we've already used several times, as a synonym for the New Testament agape. This new term resonated better with some of the ideas inherited from the pre-Christian Greek world. As a result, philanthropia soon replaced agape as the word to describe the greatest of virtues, the love praised by St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 13:13. How does humanitarianism fit this vocabulary of love for our fellow humans? As I understand the modern explanations of this concept, humanitarianism is first disinterested in the race, religion, or national identity of those who need help. In other words, it is universal. Second, it is the desire to aid all suffering humanity with no ulterior goal to convert the people who are receiving the aid or to convince them of some new way of thinking. Third, it focuses on concrete results, i.e. on assisting victims of disease, war, natural disaster, or situations of chronic poverty in a measurable way. In other words, humanitarianism demands accountability for meeting specific needs. 18th century Enlightenment thinkers criticized Christian philanthropy as not being universal, as focusing solely on helping Christians. For example, the oldest hospital of Paris, the Maison Dieu, attached to the Cathedral of Notre Dame, insisted that sick persons in need of treatment first confess their sins and receive communion before being assigned their beds. Would such an obviously Christian institution assist Jews or Muslims? Another Enlightenment criticism was that Christian philanthropy was ineffective and expensive. John Locke unfavorably compared the good works of Christian charity to the more efficacious results of science and technology. This is a quote, an extended quote from him. The study of nature, if rightly directed, may be of greater benefit to mankind than the monuments of exemplary charity that have at so great a charge been raised by the founders of hospitals and almshouses. He that first invented printing, discovered the use of the compass, or made public the virtue and right use of quinine, did more for the propagation of knowledge, for the supply and increase of useful commodities, and saved more people from the grave than those who built colleges, workhouses, and hospitals. The idea of, end of the quote from John Locke. The idea of humanitarianism, in fact, emerged from such Enlightenment critiques of traditional Christian philanthropy. In the following comments, I will examine Christian philanthropy in the East Roman or Byzantine Empire, first to see to what extent Enlightenment critics were correct in claiming that Christian efforts to help the needy were restricted only to fellow believers. Second, did Christian efforts to assist people in need also aim at spreading the kingdom of God, what secularist heirs of the Enlightenment would condemn as an ulterior goal? And finally, to what extent were the humanitarian efforts of Byzantine charitable programs measurably successful? So could they be concrete results be proven? The Christian communities of the first through the third centuries did not meet the criteria of universality. Early Christian writers demonstrate that programs of philanthropy sponsored by bishops were focused on members of the local Christian congregations. The Shepherd of Hermes, written in early 2nd century Rome, mentions a woman named Grapte who supervised the instruction of widows and orphans in the community. Some organized system to protect orphans and widows was one of the first philanthropic efforts in most Christian churches. By the 3rd century, the Didascalia Apostolorum required bishops of Syria to maintain schools where orphan boys, apparently without any legal guardians, were taught a trade, and where orphan girls were guarded until the bishops could find them suitable husbands. As late as the mid-3rd century, even the largest Christian community, Alexandria in Egypt, had no permanent philanthropic institutions. Bishop Dionysius described a plague which struck the Egyptian capital in 250 and filled the city with corpses. According to Dionysius, priests, deacons, and lay people sacrificed their lives in caring for victims of this contagious disease. The pagans, on the other hand, abandoned even their beloved relatives in Alexandria's streets. Dionysius, however, never mentions any effort on the part of his church to assist non-Christian plague victims. According to the modern concept of humanitarianism, Dionysius was not practicing humanitarianism. A little more than 100 years later, however, the church historian Zosimus describes another relief effort conducted in Edessa. When famine broke out in this area, the famous Syrian ascetic Ephraim organized a relief program to care for those whom malnutrition had weakened to the point of exhaustion. In Zosimus' account, there is no line dividing pagan from Christian, but only one separating the rich with sufficient resources from those who were starving to death. Ephraim's job was to transfer the wealth from those who had food to those who did not. Ephraim's program seems to fit better the definition of humanitarianism. What had happened between 250 AD and the early 5th century? There is no doubt that the 4th century revolutionized the Christian movement. First, the Emperor Constantine became a Christian. This automatically brought the church into the world of politics. Second, the same emperor moved the imperial capital to Constantinople in the Greek-speaking half of the Roman Empire. Third, during these same years, a priest named Arius had unleashed the debate about the proper relationship between God the Father and the Logos, the Son, a dispute which not only launched a number of heretical views about the Trinity, but also fractured local churches into quarreling denominations. At Constantinople, for example, in the 360s, there were 4 different communities, 3 Arian groups, and a small Nicene Orthodox congregation vying with one another to become the recognized church of the capital city. Fourth, this is the same period, these same years witnessed the dynamic growth of Christian monasticism in all parts of the Eastern Empire. All of these developments fostered the emergence of humanitarian efforts. Among monastic leaders of Asia Minor, Eustathius, eventually Bishop of Sebastia, from 357 to 377, played a central role in expanding the practice of Christian charity. Before becoming Bishop of Sebastia, he had spent several years in Constantinople, where he founded monastic communities for monks who pursued holiness not by retreating from the polis, from the Greek city-state, as did the anchorites of Egypt, but by selflessly serving the poor and suffering in the rapidly expanding capital city. We now know that one of his disciples, Zodikos, founded the famous Zodikos Orphanotrophion, which became the biggest charity in Constantinople, in the center of the capital, as well as a leprosarium on the north shore of the Golden Horn. Another disciple of Eustathius, Samson, opened the oldest hospital for the sick in the capital. Eustathius held a moderate Arian creed, as did Zodikos and Samson, who were both buried in Arian sanctuaries located outside the walls of Constantinople. Despite his role in defending the Nicene Creed, the Orthodox Father Basil admired Eustathius' monastic movement, and once Basil became Bishop of Caesarea in Cappadocia, he built a large leprosarium outside his episcopal city, just as Eustathius had done at Sebastia. Moreover, when John Chrysostom ascended the episcopal throne of Constantinople, he financed a number of hospitals and tried to open a second leprosarium across the Bosporus to compete with Zodicus's institution, still in the hands of an Arian community. Along with this brick and mortar campaign to construct permanent philanthropic institutions, Christian intellectuals began a campaign to move Christianity beyond the comfortable task of caring for their own widows and orphans to address major social problems. Gregory of Nazianzus' sermon, Sermon 14, concerning the love of the poor, focused on the issue of leprosy. Commenting on Luke's story of the suffering Lazarus at the gate of the rich man, Gregory portrays Lazarus as a rejected leper and the rich man and his wife as the selfish Christians who feast on delicate foods and exotic wines. By the way, Gregory goes into an amazing description of the excesses of the food. It's actually, that sermon is an unbelievable piece of rhetoric. He goes on to the story of the Christian community compared to the rich man and his wife, who are eating all these exotic foods while the dogs alone are willing to tend poor Lazarus' sores. Gregory also condemned the views of some Christians as worse than the ravings of pagans when these believers rejected lepers because they imagined that they were sick, that these sick, that is the lepers, were suffering some just judgment of God. According to Gregory, such Christians impiously presumed to know God's intentions. The punishment of leprosy could be a purification which readied its victims for paradise, while being healthy and strong might be for those who were might be preparing those who are healthy and strong for falling into the deadly sin of pride. So in other words, being in good health and good condition is not necessarily a sign of ultimate blessing. Gregory of Nyssa went even further in criticizing complacent Christians who shunned leprosy out of fear. He claimed that such fears were wrong from a scientific point of view, since most physicians denied that any disease at all was contagious. According to prevailing medical theory, sicknesses were disorders in the bodily humors caused by what we eat, or how we live, or by certain environmental conditions. Gregory of Nyssa was here following Galen's theory of diseases and ignoring the rival view of the pneumatists, who did believe that many diseases, including leprosy, spread from the polluted breath of sick people. Did Christians listen to the two Gregorys? Not immediately. From a recently edited funeral oration given in honor of John Chrysostom, we learn that when the bishop attempted to build an Orthodox leprosarium in Constantinople, neighboring landowners violently opposed his project. They appealed to the emperor and forced Chrysostom to halt construction after the first story had been completed. The author attributes the landowners' opposition to the fear of contagion. The author attributes the landowners' opposition to the fear of contagion, which the author condemns as a lie of the devil. Eventually, however, the campaign of the two Gregorys bore fruit in that the pneumatist account of leprosy disappeared from the Byzantine medical textbooks, and the disease was classified as not contagious. Here we have a case of humanitarian intentions suppressing the truth, since modern science has demonstrated that leprosy was in fact contagious, but not as contagious as many people feared in the Middle Ages. Despite the view of ecclesiastics and eventually the Greek medical profession, regular citizens were not totally convinced that living with lepers posed no risk. In the 12th century, the Emperor John II Comnenus tried to build a leprosarium as part of his famous Pantocrator monastery, but the neighbors objected, and he finally decided to use the resources for the institution to add a new dormitory for lepers to the ancient Zodicus leprosarium, which was on the other side of the Golden Horn, so out of the center of Constantinople. The emperor did not dare to accuse, though, the citizens of fearing contagion, since that would have been to accuse them of a grave sin. Rather, he made some vague reference to how overcrowded the neighborhood was around the Pantocrator and wouldn't be suited for a leprosarium. But the subtext is the neighbors didn't want it there. The Byzantine humanitarian effort on behalf of lepers eventually worked out a compromise. Leprosy might be contagious, and therefore the fears of the healthy needed to be considered, but society must not expel the victims of the disease. Rather, the church, the state, and wealthy individuals should contribute to supporting comfortable institutions close to towns, but not in them, where lepers could survive in reasonable comfort. When these leprosariums opened to, were these leprosariums open to non-Christians? Apparently they were, because we have a story from the 11th century which mentions 2 Khazar Jews who came down with leprosy and were admitted to the Zadokos institution. Both of these patients, however, were miraculously cured, and the story is actually a series of miracle tales of St. Zadokos, were actually cured at the tomb of St. Zadokos and converted to Christianity as a result of a miracle. So that isn't, I suppose, the best evidence, but initially they were admitted without having to convert to Christianity. Sources prove that the Zadokos orphanage, that's the older institution which he built inside Constantinople, was open to non-Christians. Its education program emphasized instruction in Orthodox doctrine to prepare non-Christian orphans for baptism. Moreover, in 1116, the Emperor Alexius conducted a far-reaching military campaign in Western Asia, Western Asia Minor, to collect displaced women and children in regions ravaged by the Turks. By the way, this is I didn't think of it when I first used this example, but this is a case of humanitarian emergency effort, since the emperor takes the Byzantine army into Asia Minor and rounds up displaced persons to bring them back to Constantinople, amongst whom are orphans and widows. He brought these refugees back to Constantinople and placed those children in the orphanage who had not yet been baptized and needed catechetical instruction. We also have Anna Komnena's description of Western barbarians, French and Italian children, as well as Turkish children learning Greek at the orphanage. So a lot of the orphanage children were non-Greeks and non-Christians. The Zadokos orphanage was universal, but its principal goal was to convert its young residents to Christianity. In fact, the institution was increasingly associated with St. Paul because of his role as apostle to the Gentiles. But was it effective in training people for living as adults? We do not have enough information concerning the lives of orphanotrophian graduates to judge the effectiveness of its education program. But we do know its music school had an immense effect through the centuries. As early as the 5th century, evidence exists that the children in the orphanotrophion were trained to sing in a choir. By the 9th century, this orphan choir sang at services in Hagia Sophia. The Roman orphanage, built by the popes in the 7th century, copied the music program at the Byzantine institution. In fact, there's some examples of the songs actually being sung in Greek for several centuries. With time, the choir at the Roman orphanage became so famous that people called it the Schola Cantorum. From Rome, similar orphanage spread throughout Italy. In 16th century Naples, 4 orphanages sent their boys out to sing in the street for alms. By the 18th century, a Venetian orphanage for girls attracted people from all over Europe, including Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to visit Venice and hear the girls sing under their music director, Father Antonio Vivaldi. The first orphanage for African American orphans opened in Charleston, South Carolina in 1891. To raise money for the institution, its Methodist founder organized a marching band which made tours throughout the United States and was praised for its jazzy music and its coordinated dancing, known as the Charleston. I had no idea that's actually where that came. Some here remember the Charleston dance, but my wife and I can do it. Probably modern theorists of humanitarianism are thinking of different sorts of outcomes, but on a profound cultural level, one could consider these results significant beyond measure. Byzantine hospitals to cure the sick first appeared at the end of the 4th century. They had developed from institutions to provide shelter for poor people who were streaming into the larger urban areas such as Constantinople and Antioch. The comments of the Emperor Julian, a harsh critic of Christianity, prove that these Christian charitable programs were serving pagans as well as Christians and were helping to win converts to what Julian considered an immoral cult. By the reign of Justinian, the 6th century, some hospitals had evolved into, I use the word zenons here, some zenons had evolved into hospitals exclusively for the sick. A hospital connected to the Church of St. Cosmas and Damian in the Cosmedian district of Constantinople had a specially designed room for surgery. By the 7th century, public physicians, the leading medical experts in a local Greek polis, had been transferred to the staffs of these medical centers. From that time on, poor people were able to visit these hospitals for free medicines, surgical operations, and overnight care in a bed if they had more serious health problems. We know that no one on the staffs of such hospitals were allowed to take any money from patients, nor even, not even the most respected of the physicians. How universal were the services of these Christian hospitals? If a Muslim merchant fell ill in 12th century Constantinople, would he have been excluded from the famous Pantocrator Hospital? We know that the hospital provided 2 chapels for patients and a priest to sing the liturgies and to hear confessions, but unlike many Western Catholic hospitals, confession was not required. In other words, it was available. We know from some of these Catholic ones that when you came in, before you got to bed, you had to confess your sins as part of the healing process. But I have not found that in any of the Byzantine hospitals that was required. Available, but not required. Although we have no evidence of Muslim patients, 2 texts mention Muslim physicians working in Byzantine hospitals. Vaticanus Graecus 299 includes a long list of medical preparations. One of them, on folio 374, is attributed to a Saracen physician named Abram, who held a staff position at the Mangana Hospital in Constantinople. Moreover, on a visit to Constantinople in 1437, Cardinal Nicholas Cusa met a Turkish Muslim who served the Byzantine government as an inspector of the city's hospitals. If Muslims served as staff physicians, would they have been excluded from being patients? Now, that's a question we can't answer, but I'm assuming that they could be patients. Did Byzantine hospitals have any concept of how to measure their success in restoring patients to health? We have no record of how many patients per day or per month were received at any Byzantine hospital, or what number of those who were admitted experienced a cure and left the institution healthy. Those kind of statistics do exist for 15th century Italian hospitals, but nothing for Byzantium. We do, however, have an account from the 10th century concerning a subdeacon named Sergius, who was attacked by robbers in Constantinople and left for dead in the streets. This is a little aside, but I think it's sort of interesting. According to many sources, the Byzantine capital had a big crime problem. Recent research in Hagia Sophia shows they actually had holes for bars because people would get into try to steal things even out of Hagia Sophia. Attendants found Sergius in the morning and brought him to the Eubulus Hospital. There the physicians treated him for 7 days, but when they had decided that his condition was fatal, they had him transferred out of the Eubulus Hospital to another facility which tended old and terminally ill patients. This story illustrates that Byzantine hospitals were aware of meeting a specific humanitarian goal, curing, and I make this point, although I've gotten in a lot of trouble, but I think the sources make it clear, curing, not caring for sick people. So if you couldn't be cured, this wasn't the place to be. There were other institutions, hospices without the medical care where you could be fed and have a warm place in a bed. If a patient could not be cured, he could not remain in a hospital bed. No philanthropic facility in Catholic Europe, so far as I know, had the same sense of a singular mission. So my impression is that the notion of modern humanitarianism can be seen even in these examples that we've looked at this morning. Thank you.